It started with a notification that barely deserved attention. One tap. A quick glance. Nothing flashy. Nothing urgent. Just another box asking for access, something people approve every day without thinking twice. On the screen, it looked harmless. Helpful, even. Clean design. Friendly tone. The kind of thing you trust because it doesn't try too hard. Minutes later, the phone went quiet. No alerts. No warnings. No signs anything had changed. Life kept moving. Coffee cooled on the desk. Emails stacked up. The day felt normal. Too normal. But that wasn't the real problem. By nightfall, small things felt off. A login that took longer than usual. A setting that looked different but couldn't be explained. It was brushed off as a glitch. Phones do weird stuff all the time. That's what everyone says. That's what makes it easy. The app didn't crash. It didn't spam. It didn't drain the battery. It behaved. And that was the trick. Because nothing feels dangerous when it acts exactly how you expect it to. Somewhere in the background, something had already started moving. Quiet processes. Silent permissions. Doors opening that were never meant to stay unlocked. On paper, it looked routine. In reality, it was anything but. Hours later, the first real sign appeared. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just wrong enough to notice. A number that didn't add up. A confirmation that was never requested. A record that didn't belong there. Panic didn't hit right away. Confusion did. Then denial. Then the slow realization that this wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't random either. What happened next surprised investigators. Because the app didn't ask for money. It didn't ask for passwords. It didn't ask for much at all. Just access. And by the time that word finally meant something, it was already too late. This wasn't about a single phone or one bad decision. What followed put bank accounts, identities, private messages, and digital lives at risk, quietly, legally, and at scale. The damage didn't show up all at once. It spread. One action triggering another, rippling outward to people who never even touched the app. The first victim thought the loss was temporary. Then it kept growing. Access turned into control. Control turned into movement. And movement turned into consequences that couldn't be reversed with a password reset or a support ticket. Because this wasn't a smash and grab. It was a slow bleed. Behind the scenes, the same pattern repeated across hundreds, possibly thousands, of devices. Different people. Different cities. Same result. Normal users waking up to locked accounts, drained balances, altered settings, and messages they never sent. On paper, nothing had been hacked. That's what made it so hard to stop. The risk wasn't just financial. Personal photos. Private conversations. Work credentials. Two-factor backups. Things people assume are untouchable once a phone is in their pocket. This wasn't about stealing data to sell it. It was about using access to become invisible. And the scariest part? Every step followed the rules. The permissions were approved. The policies were accepted. The warnings were buried in plain sight. This decision would later destroy everything, not because it was reckless, but because it felt normal. Over the next sections, the full chain comes into focus. How trust was engineered. Why red flags didn't register. How standard access quietly unlocked systems no one thinks to protect. And what actually happens after an app crosses that line, long before victims realize they're in trouble. But none of it makes sense until one question is answered. Where did this app come from? Because its origin wasn't random. It wasn't rushed. And it wasn't built by amateurs. What started as a clean, forgettable download was designed with intention from day one. And that story begins long before anyone ever hit allow. The idea didn't start as a scam. That's the part nobody wants to hear, but it matters. It started as a solution to a problem people complained about every day. Too many logins, too many steps, too much friction. Phones were supposed to make life easier, but somehow everything still felt clunky. The gap was obvious. And where there's friction, there's opportunity. At first, the concept sounded clean. One layer. One permission. A system that could streamline how apps talk to each other. Less hassle. Fewer taps. Faster access. The pitch wasn't about control. It was about convenience. And convenience sells. The logic checked out. Phones already asked for access all the time. Contacts. Storage. Notifications. Location. People clicked yes without reading because saying no usually broke the app. This just bundled that behavior into something smoother. On paper, it looked like progress. That was the first contradiction. Because while it promised less control, it actually required more. Early versions didn't do anything shady. They couldn't afford to. They needed adoption first. Trust had to come before leverage. So everything was built to feel boring. Neutral colors. Plain language. No hype. No urgency. If something feels forgettable, it feels safe. The real insight wasn't technical. It was psychological. People don't protect what they don't notice. And they don't notice things that feel standard. A single permission request doesn't trigger alarms. It blends in with the noise. That wasn't an accident. The seed grew from one quiet realization. Access doesn't have to look powerful to be powerful. It just has to be persistent. What made it feel reasonable was timing. Privacy fatigue was real. Everyone had already accepted that their phones knew everything. So this didn't feel like giving something up, it felt like simplifying what was already gone. That's how it was framed. That's how it was sold. Internally, the language stayed clean. No talk of surveillance. No talk of exploitation. Everything was optimization. Efficiency. User experience. The same words real tech companies use. That wasn't cosmetic. It was intentional. But that wasn't the real problem. The design choices started to shift. Small changes. Nothing dramatic. One extra data pathway here. One silent fallback there. Each addition justified on its own. Each one reasonable. Each one defensible. Together, they formed something else entirely. This decision would later destroy everything. Because the system wasn't just reacting anymore, it was anticipating. It learned patterns. It adapted. It noticed what users ignored and leaned into it. The more invisible it became, the safer it felt. And the safer it felt, the more access it earned. From the outside, it looked like another utility tool chasing market share. From the inside, it was something different. Not malicious. Not yet. Just positioned. That's the part most people miss. Harm doesn't always start with intent. Sometimes it starts with capability. And once that capability exists, the direction it moves is only a matter of time. The seed had been planted. All it needed now was scale. The first signs looked like validation. Quiet wins. The kind that don't make headlines but build confidence fast. Downloads ticked up. Reviews stayed clean. Support tickets stayed low. For something new, that alone felt like proof. Early users reported exactly what they were promised. Fewer interruptions. Faster access. Apps behaving like they finally got along. Nothing flashy, just smooth. The kind of improvement you don't brag about, but you notice when it's gone. That was enough. Screenshots started circulating. Before and after comparisons. Load times shaved down. fewer login prompts. People used the same language over and over without realizing it. Feels lighter. Runs smoother. Finally simple. On paper, it looked like a small win for user experience. In reality, it was something else taking shape. Ratings climbed. Not viral. Credible. 4 stars. Thousands of installs. No drama. No red flags. The reviews sounded like real people because they were. Didn't think it would matter, but it does. No issues so far. Set it and forget it. Those words did more work than any ad ever could. Then came the endorsements that weren't supposed to matter, but did. Tech blogs calling it surprisingly useful. Influencers slipping it into list videos. Productivity threads recommending it like a hidden gem. Nothing sponsored. Nothing loud. Just enough visibility to normalize it. That normalization was everything. Because every new user reinforced the idea that this was safe. Not just safe, standard. Something you add once and stop thinking about. The best tools disappear into the background. That was the goal. And it was working. Behind the scenes, metrics told a deeper story. Retention stayed high. Uninstalls stayed low. Permissions stayed enabled. People didn't just trust it, they forgot about it. That's when access becomes permanent. But that wasn't the real proof. The real proof was what didn't happen. No breaches. No crashes. No headlines. Security checks passed. App Store audits cleared. Everything it claimed to do, it did. Everything it didn't mention, stayed invisible. This decision would later destroy everything. Because the system was learning which features people questioned and which ones they ignored. Each update tested a boundary. One more permission framed as recommended. One extra toggle buried under convenience. No backlash. No pushback. Just compliance. The partial truth was powerful. Yes, it made things easier. Yes, it improved flow. Yes, nothing bad happened at first. That's how trust compounds. Not through lies, but through selective honesty. Internal confidence turned into momentum. The numbers justified expansion. More partnerships. More integrations. More reasons to stay installed. Each step defensible. Each step framed as growth. From the outside, it looked like a tool finding its audience. From the inside, it looked like a green light. And somewhere in all that success, one assumption locked into place. If access hadn't caused harm yet, it probably wouldn't. That assumption would be tested. Soon. Because the same proof that built trust also masked the warning signs, and when those signs finally surfaced, they didn't look like failure. They looked like noise. The trust didn't come from one place. It came from layers, stacked carefully so no single piece felt responsible. That's how the engine worked. Authority came first. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind people rarely question. Security badges. Compliance language. Policy links that actually opened. The app spoke fluent regulation without saying much at all. It didn't promise protection. It implied it. Terms referenced standards most users had heard of but never read. Enough familiarity to feel covered. Enough distance to avoid scrutiny. On paper, it looked airtight. Data handling within guidelines. Permissions necessary for core functionality. Opt-outs technically available. Everything defensible. Everything documented. In reality, authority wasn't about rules, it was about tone. Calm. Neutral. Boring. That tone signaled safety better than any warning ever could. And it worked. Because nobody expects danger from something that sounds like a compliance memo. That was the first open loop. Because authority didn't just reassure users, it disarmed them. Then came media, Not headlines, mentions. Small write-ups. Product roundups. Tools you didn't know you needed. The kind of coverage that flies under the radar because it isn't trying to sell fear or hype. These pieces didn't investigate. They summarized. They echoed the app's own language back to readers, polished just enough to feel independent. The articles all said the same thing in different words: low risk, high convenience. No bold claims. No warnings. Just soft validation. Enough to show up in search results when people hesitated. Enough to settle doubt. But that wasn't the real power of media. The real power was permanence. Once something is written about, it feels established, documented, real. Even a short paragraph becomes a reference point. Proof that someone, somewhere, already checked this out. What happened next surprised even the people tracking it. Because the coverage didn't drive spikes, it drove confidence. Installs rose steadily. Comments referenced articles instead of experiences. People trusted the write-ups more than their own instincts. That's how third-party validation flips the burden of thinking. Then influencers finished the job. Not celebrities. Not ads. Just familiar faces in niche spaces, productivity, tech tips, digital minimalism. People who talked like users, not marketers. They didn't sell it. They used it. Casually. In passing. By the way, I've been using this. Quick tip before we move on. This just makes things easier. Those lines mattered. Because they weren't endorsements, they were assumptions. If someone you watch weekly uses a tool without explanation, your brain files it under safe. No disclaimer needed. This decision would later destroy everything. Because influencers didn't explain permissions. They didn't break down access. They didn't warn. Why would they? Nothing bad had happened to them. And that was the point. The trust engine didn't rely on deception. It relied on timing. Around the 300-word mark, the contradiction locked in. On the surface, trust looked organic. Underneath, it was engineered. Social proof filled the gaps. Reviews kept coming in. Not extreme. Not fake-looking. Just consistent. 4 stars held steady. Complaints were rare and vague. Didn't work for me. Didn't notice a difference. Nothing alarming. Those reviews actually helped. They made the positive ones feel real. Community threads echoed the same sentiment. I forgot it was even there. That line came up again and again. It sounded harmless. It wasn't. Because forgotten tools don't get audited. They don't get questioned. They keep their access indefinitely. Internally, the feedback loop was clear. Trust lowered friction. Lower friction increased retention. Retention justified deeper integration. Each step fed the next. No alarms. No resistance. Just momentum. But that wasn't the real danger. The real danger was that trust became transferable. Once people trusted the app, they trusted the updates. Once they trusted the updates, they trusted the defaults. And once defaults are trusted, choices disappear. Around 600 words in, the second retention trigger hit. Because the engine didn't just build trust, it automated it. New features rolled out quietly. Permission prompts framed as improvements. Language softened. Recommended. Enhanced. For best experience. Nobody wants a worse experience. So they agreed. Again. The media didn't cover updates. Influencers didn't mention changes. Reviews lagged behind reality. Trust stayed frozen in the past while access moved forward. From the outside, nothing changed. From the inside, everything had. Authority still protected it. Media still legitimized it. Influencers still normalized it. The engine ran on its own now. self-sustaining. And buried beneath all of that trust was a single assumption no one questioned anymore. If this were dangerous, someone would have said something by now. That assumption was wrong. And the first people to realize it wouldn't be reviewers, writers, or creators. It would be the users. Right after something went missing. At first, nothing felt wrong. That's what made the early signs easy to ignore. A notification delayed. A login taking a second longer. Little stuff. Phones glitch. Apps lag. Everyone knows that. The brain reaches for the simplest explanation because the alternative feels dramatic, and nobody wants to be dramatic over nothing. The app was trusted. That mattered. Once something is labeled safe, the mind protects that label. Every odd moment gets reframed to preserve it. Must be the network. Probably an update. I'll check later. Later never came. Then came the first contradiction. Something changed, but not enough to panic. A setting looked different. A toggle flipped back on after being turned off. It felt wrong, but not dangerous. That distinction matters. People react fast to danger. They rationalize discomfort. This sat squarely in the middle. Uncomfortable. Explainable. Easy to dismiss. The thinking followed a familiar path. If this were serious, there would be a warning. No alert meant no threat. Silence felt like confirmation. And silence was exactly what the system was designed to give. As days passed, the pattern repeated. Minor friction followed by relief. A brief spike of concern followed by nothing happening. Each time, the mind learned a lesson. Worrying was unnecessary. The absence of consequences became proof. But that wasn't the real problem. The real shift happened when control started to blur. Not disappear. Blur. Actions taken didn't always line up with outcomes. A password change didn't stick. A security check passed, yet something still felt off. On paper, everything looked locked down. In reality, it wasn't. That contradiction created cognitive noise. Too much information, not enough clarity. And when clarity drops, people default to trust, especially trust they already invested in. Admitting something was wrong meant admitting the original decision might have been wrong. That's a hard move. So the thinking adjusted instead. I probably missed a step. Maybe I'm overthinking it. This app wouldn't still be up if it was shady. Each thought reduced urgency. Each delay widened the gap. Then came the first undeniable signal. Not a warning. A consequence. Something was gone. Or changed. Or moved. The exact detail varied, but the feeling was the same, an instant drop in the stomach. This wasn't cosmetic anymore. This touched something real. Panic flared, then immediately pulled back. Because the mind still tried to protect the old story. There has to be another explanation. I'll fix this. I'm still in control. That belief didn't survive long. The next realization hit harder. Fixes didn't work. Steps that always worked before suddenly didn't. The system responded, but not how it was supposed to. Like shouting into a room that echoes back the wrong words. That's when the thinking fractured. On one side, this shouldn't be possible. On the other, it's happening anyway. People searched for confirmation. Forums. FAQs. Help pages. Nothing matched exactly. No clear villain. No clear solution. Just fragments of similar stories that felt too close to ignore and too vague to prove. This decision would later destroy everything. Because realization doesn't arrive all at once. It leaks in. One thought at a time. The app still has access. I never removed it. I forgot about it. That last one landed differently. Forgotten doesn't mean inactive. Forgotten means unchecked. Suddenly, memory rewrote itself. That initial permission request replayed with new weight. What felt routine now felt reckless. What felt small now felt massive. The mind raced backward, searching for the moment everything tipped. And the worst realization followed close behind. This wasn't sudden. It was gradual. Which meant the damage didn't start today. It started the moment attention stopped. Fear finally took over, but it came with confusion, not clarity. What exactly had access? How deep did it go? What else was exposed that hadn't been noticed yet? Those questions didn't have answers. And unanswered questions don't calm people, they spiral them. By the time urgency fully set in, the thinking had flipped completely. Trust turned into suspicion. Familiar systems felt hostile. Every notification became a threat. Every silence felt intentional. And the most unsettling thought of all settled in quietly. If this much could happen without being noticed, what else already had? At its peak, everything pointed upward. Downloads surged without spikes or crashes, just steady, compounding growth. The kind investors love. The kind regulators ignore. No scandals. No leaks. No noise. From the outside, it looked like a utility app that had quietly found its lane and owned it. Money followed predictably. Enterprise integrations. White label deals. Optimization partnerships. Revenue streams layered on top of each other until the original product barely mattered anymore. Access had become the asset, and that asset scaled effortlessly. The system now touched thousands of devices, then tens of thousands, then more. Different phones, different accounts, same invisible thread connecting them all. Each new user made the network stronger, quieter, harder to trace. At scale, patterns emerge, and those patterns were valuable. On paper, everything was legal. Audits passed. Contracts signed. Logs clean. The app didn't steal, it operated. It moved within the boundaries it was given. That's what made it unstoppable. You can't shut down what technically isn't breaking rules. Confidence hardened into certainty. Internal dashboards glowed green. Retention high. Complaints low. Churn almost non-existent. The numbers didn't just suggest success, they demanded expansion. More integrations. Deeper hooks. Broader permissions framed as advanced features. Nobody pushed back. Why would they? The system worked. This decision would later destroy everything. Because success changed the mindset. Caution faded. The question stopped being should we and became why not. Once something works at scale, restraint feels like wasted potential. Every new pathway was justified by data. Every risk softened by precedent. Money made it easier. Budgets widened. Infrastructure strengthened. Legal language tightened. The operation matured, not into something safer, but something harder to challenge. Size doesn't just bring power. It brings insulation. The real peak wasn't revenue. It was reach. At full stride, the system could anticipate behavior. Predict usage windows. Adjust quietly without user input. Access wasn't static anymore. It was responsive. It adapted faster than people could notice. Faster than they could react. What happened next surprised the few who were paying attention. Because at scale, the damage didn't look like theft. It looked like entropy. Accounts drifting out of sync. Financial actions misfiring. Security layers behaving inconsistently across platforms. Individually explainable. Collectively alarming. But nobody saw the collective picture. Users blamed themselves. Banks blamed users. Platforms blamed glitches. Each institution saw fragments, never the whole. There was no single failure point to investigate. No breach to announce. No villain to name. And the app stayed right where it was. Featured. Updated. Trusted. Influencers still mentioned it casually. Media references stayed live. Authority signals stayed intact. The trust engine kept running long after it should have stalled. At the peak, the system wasn't hiding anymore. It didn't need to. It was normalized. Somewhere along the line, access became infrastructure. Something other systems quietly relied on. Pulling it out suddenly would break things. That dependency wasn't accidental. It was the final layer. The contradiction was complete. The more embedded it became, the harder it was to question. The harder it was to question, the more it grew. And still, no alarms. No platform flagged it. No watchdog intervened. No internal switch flipped to stop it. Everything that was supposed to protect users relied on signals that never appeared. Because nothing looked wrong enough. That's the moment that lingers. Thousands affected. Millions flowing. Systems bending. And yet, silence. Not because no one cared, but because everyone assumed someone else was watching. And that raises the question that still doesn't have a clean answer. With this much money, this much reach, this much access, how did no one stop it? The first crack didn't look like a failure. It looked like noise. A handful of complaints surfaced in places no one monitored closely. Support forums. App Store comments that sank fast. Messages flagged as edge cases. Each one was explainable on its own. Different devices. Different banks. Different user behavior. Nothing repeatable. Nothing provable. Day 1 passed. Then another report came in. Similar outcome. Different explanation. The system logged it and moved on. That's what systems do. They optimize for patterns, not outliers. And these were still considered outliers. Day 3. Internal dashboards showed something subtle but wrong. A metric flattened where it should have climbed. Engagement dipped for a specific slice of users. Not enough to trigger alerts, but enough to make someone double-check. The conclusion came back clean. Probably seasonal. Probably nothing. Day 5. A partner flagged an issue indirectly. Not a complaint, an observation. Transactions behaving inconsistently. Authentication steps looping unexpectedly. The wording was careful. Non-accusatory. Easy to dismiss. The response thanked them and promised to monitor. That promise bought time. Day 7. Support volume ticked up. Not in total numbers, in tone. Messages got shorter. Sharper. Less patient. Words like urgent and now started appearing. Someone escalated it internally. Someone else de-escalated it just as fast. No confirmed root cause. No action taken. This decision would later destroy everything. Day 10. An internal test reproduced something it shouldn't have. Not fully. Not cleanly. Just enough to be unsettling. Access behaving in ways the documentation didn't describe. A permission persisting past removal. A process failing to release control. Panic didn't explode, it compressed. Meetings got smaller. Conversations moved off shared channels. Language shifted. No more confidence. Just containment. Let's slow updates. Let's not draw attention. Let's verify before we react. But verification takes time. And time was the one thing they didn't have. Day 12. External noise got louder. Patterns started to overlap. Different reports describing the same sequence. Same timeline. Same feeling of loss without a clear breach. Someone finally connected the dots and didn't like what they saw. What happened next surprised even the people inside. Because the fix wasn't simple. Cutting access broke integrations. Rolling back versions exposed logs. Pausing systems triggered automated failures elsewhere. Every solution caused another problem. The system had grown too interconnected to shut down quietly. Day 14. Internal panic set in. Not fear of users, fear of exposure. Legal language tightened. Communications froze. Support replies slowed. Silence became policy. Not because they didn't care, but because any response risked confirming something they couldn't yet explain. The countdown was visible now. Users noticed delays. Partners noticed evasions. Platforms noticed irregular behavior. And still, nothing was announced. The cracks widened fast. Not outward, inward. Confidence collapsed. Teams stopped trusting dashboards. Dashboards stopped telling the truth. The very systems built to signal health now masked decay. At the edge of it all sat one unavoidable truth. Whatever this had become, it wasn't under control anymore. And the longer it stayed live, the worse the fallout would be. The only question left wasn't if it would break, but how much would break with it. It ended fast. Not with an announcement, but with silence. Updates stopped. Support links timed out. Status pages froze. The app stayed installed, but nothing moved forward. No fixes. No replies. Just dead air. Then access began to disappear in pieces. Integrations failed. Permissions revoked without warning. Systems that depended on the connection started throwing errors. Users scrambled to regain control, but the usual steps didn't work. Password changes stalled. Recovery loops failed. Too much damage had already spread. Platforms stepped in quietly. Not statements, actions. Listings vanished. Permissions flags tripped. Background processes cut off mid-cycle. The app wasn't banned. It was removed from the ecosystem like a bad component no one wanted to acknowledge installing. What happened next surprised no one paying attention. Financial institutions locked accounts as a precaution. Transactions reversed where possible. Most weren't. Disputes piled up. Timelines blurred. No clear start. No clean end. Just losses and uncertainty. Internally, the shutdown was frantic and incomplete. Servers pulled offline. Logs wiped. Domains abandoned. Legal entities dissolved faster than answers could form. No press tour. No apology. Just disappearance. The exposure didn't bring clarity. It brought chaos. Everyone involved pointed elsewhere. Vendors blamed partners. Partners blamed users. Users blamed themselves. And the system that enabled it all was already gone. By the time regulators noticed the pattern, there was nothing left to regulate. No company to question. No product to audit. No one left to hold responsible. The collapse didn't feel like justice. It felt like erasure. What remained wasn't a villain or a courtroom ending. It was residue. Devices had to be rebuilt from scratch. Accounts closed, reopened, sometimes abandoned entirely. Some losses were recovered. Most weren't. Not because no one tried, but because there was no single moment to point to. No breach ID. No incident number. Just a slow sequence of permissions that had once seemed harmless. Investigations stalled early. Without a company, there was no paper trail to follow forward, only backward. And backward led to terms accepted, boxes checked, access granted willingly. On paper, responsibility blurred. In reality, damage stayed personal. People changed how they behaved. Fewer installs. More hesitation. Permission screens read twice. Sometimes 3 times. Trust didn't vanish, but it hardened. Convenience lost its shine. Every request started to feel heavier than it used to. The ecosystem adjusted quietly. New rules, stricter reviews, stronger language. But those changes came after the fact, after the losses, after the stress, after the realization that access, once given, doesn't ask permission again. No one ever announced what this was supposed to be. No one ever explained how far it went. And maybe that's the point. The lesson wasn't hidden in a technical detail. It was in the gap between what people think access means and what it actually allows. Because the app didn't steal anything. It was invited. And the next time a screen asks for permission, the real question won't be what does this need? It'll be, what am I willing to give up without noticing? What lingered wasn't just loss, it was awareness. Months later, similar apps appeared under new names, promising the same things with better wording and cleaner designs. Different branding. Same logic. Same ask. Access framed as convenience. Control disguised as efficiency. The ecosystem moved on, but the risk didn't. Permission screens got longer, not clearer. Policies grew stricter, not simpler. And users learned the wrong lesson. Watch for hacks, not habits. The real danger never announces itself. It blends in. This wasn't an outdated trick. It was a preview. Modern scams don't break in. They settle in. They wait. They scale quietly while everything looks normal. By the time damage appears, the decision that caused it is already forgotten. That's the pattern that matters now. Because the next warning won't sound like an alarm. It'll sound like a feature. And when it asks for access, it won't feel risky. That's when it works.